Our keynote speaker for the evening is Dr. Clayborne Carson. You've heard his name already. And we're so grateful. He actually flew in from California yesterday evening to join us for this event. His admiration for Gandhi's legacy is closely connected to the role, as he is the editor of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. And he's the founding director of the King Research and Educational Institute. He's made numerous trips to India to meet with Gandhian activists, and he was instrumental in organizing the Gandhi King Global Initiative Conference at Stanford University in October 2019, when we were commemorating Gandhiji's 150th birth anniversary. And I did have the fortune to come over to that three-day program, and it was phenomenal. He was professor at the Stanford University, where he primarily taught US history and African American history, and he did this for more than 4 decades. After his so-called retirement, which was about 2 years ago, he founded the World House Project, where he has drawn attention to the Black American Gandhian relationship. And he's done this through podcasts, website exhibits, and audio-visual lectures. He has served as creative advisor for the King National Historic Park and the National Civil and Human Rights Museum in Atlanta. Last year, Dr. Carson was nominated by President Joe Biden to serve as the member of the newly formed Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. Now, he's got an extensive resume, but I can tell you I spent the morning with Dr. Carson and I learned 3 things. One is he's a huge basketball fan, and we're going to forgive him for being a Warriors fan. 2, he amazingly has quick recovery. Believe it or not, 6 days ago, Dr. Carson was in the ICU at a hospital in California. And apparently he was practicing his three-pointers at a basketball gym, and I'm not sure what happened, but an ambulance came and it had to take him to the hospital. But the third thing, and the most important thing, I know we have a lot to learn, and he has a lot to teach us. So without further ado, please give a Texas-sized welcome to our keynote speaker of the evening, all the way from California, Dr. Clayborne Carson.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And just to explain, I wasn't shooting my three-pointers. I never missed those. So I made the mistake. I was at a public park, and a young high school student who's on her basketball team and her father were there. And she was just practicing her moves and her shots. And her father said, I'll play guard and you two play offense. And that was my mistake. I have a deal with my wife that I just shoot baskets and they usually go in. I'll play horse with anyone, including Stephen Curry. But playing an actual game where I have to run and jump is out of bounds. And I've learned my lesson. And the first thing I asked, though, when I was in the ICU was, can I come to Houston? And they said, yeah, you might not look your best, but if no one notices you've got a black eye, then go for it. And so here I am. And it really is a pleasure because the Gandhian legacy has been such a central part of my life, and I should start by acknowledging that what I began to do when I started to write history was to understand the movement I was so much a part of. I was at the March on Washington, and not very many people can say that anymore. And that was just the beginning of my involvement in the movement. But I was one of those young people who thought that the highlight of the march was not Martin Luther King, he's the old guy. John Lewis was the person I really wanted to hear because he was the young person there who represented a new generation who thought that Martin Luther King was moving too slowly. And just before the march, I met a young fellow student from Howard University. His name was Stokely Carmichael. And he was wondering, why do you want to go to the march? Why don't you join us in someplace in the South? I think he mentioned Albany, Georgia. And I didn't want to tell him at that time that just coming to the march, at that point, I was still just finishing my first year in college, was the most radical thing I'd ever done. And that I had gotten to the march without telling my parents. They didn't find out until several years later that I went, and that I hitchhiked home, and got very much involved. I grew up in New Mexico, transferred to UCLA, and really became deeply involved in another kind of movement, an urban movement. We thought that less that we were following Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther King was following us. Because if you remember, I got there in 1964, at the end of 1964. In 1965, South Central Los Angeles blew up, and Martin Luther King rushed to the scene to try to see what he could do. And what he could do was not very much. This was a situation that came as a shock to him, and in many ways a turning point in his life. Because if some of you know about his biography, you know that the year after that he left the South, went to Chicago with his family, with Coretta, and began organizing in Chicago and finding that the mob that threw rocks at him, bricks at him, were Northerners and carrying Nazi flags. He said, I'd never faced an angrier mob than the one I faced trying to integrate Chicago suburbs. And I think some of you who have a history of understanding the changes that went on in the United States knows that that was a major turning point in his life and in the lives of so many people, because we began to understand something very essential, that the problem of race was not located in the South only. It was something that was ingrained in American history, and it was all over. And Martin Luther King tried for the rest of his life to get that focus. We think of him as a civil rights leader, but in truth, just days before South Central Los Angeles blew up, the Voting Rights Act was passed. So as a civil rights leader, that element of his life was finished. Now, he would never get another piece of civil rights legislation. The only one that was passed after that was passed after his death. As kind of a memento to him to do something about housing discrimination. And that's one of the parts of his life that I think he's very proud of, but at that point he was trying to do something different, and that was a Poor People's Campaign. And so I think the way I would address King and Gandhi in terms of their relationship is we have to understand that in many respects they died thinking that they had failed, that they achieved what the big goal, India got its independence, the United States got certain civil rights legislation, but a lot of work was undone. And this is a message that I think a museum for Gandhi can deliver, that the struggle goes on. That's why after my retirement, in addition to playing basketball when I shouldn't, I still teach every Monday. I teach a group of young people. I've been teaching them for years now. They are doing this as volunteers. They want to, they're nominated by their teachers as leaders, not because they get A's in the classroom, but because other students looked to them for leadership. And so as an after-school activity, they get together with other students who are similar to that, and working together, they become better leaders. Those students, as we speak, are traveling through the South, learning more about the movement that took place in the South. This is one of their many trips. Every summer they go someplace where they can learn together. The Monday morning, I call it an office hour actually, but it's kind of a joke in the sense that some of you, all your professors probably had office hours. How many of you actually went to an office hour? Other than to complain about bad grade or, or to get a letter of recommendation. And these students actually come because they want to learn. They want to discuss. They want to argue with me. And that's so enriching. Just right before my fall, I invited them all, a group of them, over to my home. And we do this right before they leave for their summer trip. And we had this wonderful meal, and the discussion would have gone on till midnight. And it's not like they were listening to me, they were talking to me. And it was the best teaching I think I've ever done. Because they weren't motivated to get a better job, they weren't motivated to get a grade. They wanted to learn how to change the world for the better. Yeah, thank you. Thank them. And I think that brings us to why it's so important to have this museum. For Martin Luther King, the relationship to Gandhi was complicated because he was not a Gandhian expert at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott. He learned fast, he did a crash course, but the important thing that you should know is that he got lots of help from other black leaders who knew far more about Gandhi because they had been there. They had met Gandhi. They had corresponded with him. One of the untold stories of Gandhi and King is that there is a phenomenon of black Gandhians. It has existed, that group has existed since the 1920s. If you go back to the Crisis magazine, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, produced this W.E.B. Du Bois, and some of you probably know that name, but Du Bois was the leading black intellectual of the 20th century. If you don't know the name, you probably should learn it. And he was the main person in the NAACP, which was founded in 1909. So by the 1920s, Gandhi is writing to Du Bois, explaining what the Gandhian movement is about. After World War I, you could see that black American newspapers picked up the story of Gandhi's movement. More people wanted to go. In 1935, I think it was 35 or 36, it might have been both actually, but a delegation of black leaders went to India, spent time with Gandhi. We have a transcript of that meeting in which they asked probing questions. Mr. Gandhi, what would you do about lynching? Would nonviolence be sufficient to deal with that? They weren't always satisfied with his answers. I knew one of the people who went on that delegation, Sue Bailey Thurman. She passed away about 25 years ago. And she mentioned about how she had asked, well, Mr. Gandhi, if someone lynched your brother, how would you respond? And he talked about responding with nonviolence. And she wasn't very satisfied. And she said, no, that's not how I would respond. And so they had a real discussion. In that delegation was Benjamin Mays, who becomes president of Morehouse College, where he lectured every Tuesday to his Morehouse students, who included Martin Luther King Jr., about the Gandhian movement. Howard Thurman came back to the United States, became a minister in San Francisco of one of the first interracial churches in America. Now this is 1940s, the first interracial churches in the United States. Now, some historians have said, well, you have these certain kinds of evangelical churches where part of the audience was black, but you don't have a church where one of the ministers is white, one of the ministers is black, and they maintained that through the 1940s, and that was the first church where the leadership was both black and white. So what people like Benjamin Mays learned is that there was this other movement going on that was changing the world, attracting the attention of the world, influencing anti-colonial struggles that are going on around the world. That part of the story, I think most of you would probably accept that, obviously Gandhi had a lot of influence in those anti-colonial struggles. But right here in the United States, you see leaders such as Benjamin Mays, the president of Howard University, also went on that trip. And of course, a woman, Sue Bailey Thurman, was part of the delegation. And this was just the beginning. Later on in the 1940s, and 1950s, you have two key individuals. One of them is Bayard Rustin. How many of you, just indicate by raising your hand a little bit, have you ever heard of Bayard Rustin? Not many, right? A few people. He's crucial because when Martin Luther King is selected as the leader of a boycott, by the way, Martin Luther King didn't start the Montgomery bus boycott. Women did it, organized it, made it 100% successful. The evening after the first day of the boycott, they have a meeting and decide who is going to be the spokesperson for this movement, that it was organized all by women. And Martin Luther King, because he's a new minister in town, he's very articulate, is selected in that job. But he has no background in it. He's never been a protester. Actually, one of the things that I've taught in my classes is that Coretta Scott King was the protester. She was the one who was an active member of the Progressive Party during the late 1940s. She went to the Progressive Party convention as a delegate at a time when Martin Luther King couldn't even vote. So their discussions about politics, you can imagine, she's finding out whether he can follow her in terms of her political views rather than the other way around. And so what we see is that Martin Luther King is faced with a problem. He's a leader of a movement he's unprepared to lead. And that's when he begins to study. Bayard Rustin comes to town and says, I've been studying Gandhi. In fact, your wife has heard me speak. And I know a lot about, because I've already been to India. Another person comes, his name is James Lawson. A few of you might know that name, but James Lawson and Bayard Rustin are crucial in terms of carrying this out. Rustin becomes King's closest advisor. He has a background, by the way, including membership in the Young Communist League, so that makes him a target for the FBI during this time. But King keeps that relationship, but he also accepts the advice of James Lawson, who comes after spending the early 1950s in India studying Gandhi. And he comes back, and what he does is he goes to Vanderbilt Divinity School and begins organizing a workshop. In that workshop are nearly all the leaders of the freedom rides of the early 1960s. One of them is John Lewis. Another is Diane Nash. These are names you should know. They learned about Gandhi through James Lawson. And so when they entered the movement, it wasn't to follow King, it was to push ahead of King. Because when the Freedom Riders come to Atlanta in 1960 and ask him to join them in 1961, he says, no, it's too dangerous. I won't go. They go anyway. And 400 to 500 of the Freedom Riders are arrested in Mississippi, and that launches a new element in the movement. So I'm telling you this history simply to indicate that, this often happens. I'm telling you this history simply because it's not just a matter of Gandhi's influence on Martin Luther King, it's Gandhi's influence on a movement. And that's what is important to convey to the next generation, that many of these people saw themselves as moving ahead of Martin Luther King and carrying on his struggle. So I'll just end with one of the basic messages from Martin Luther King comes in his last book. It's called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? I think it's his most important book, and it really becomes the basis of my project, the World House Project, because he describes the world house that we're all living in. We need to learn how to live in the world house peacefully, with justice. We still have a long way to go. I don't think we've answered his question. I think that these are the unanswered questions, and I think the main reason is that it's a difficult question. It's only 6 words, but you have to know, how did we get to here? What direction are we moving? And most importantly, who are we? Who are we who are going to build this world house? And when we answer that, I think both Gandhi and Martin Luther King will be smiling. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson, and we look forward to our continued collaboration, and we have so much to learn from you.